I wonder if you, Sean Speer, and other conservatives are forgetting their history, and forgetting even the history of Canadian conservatism, because there's a tendency to be very, very disdainful towards this idea of DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the truth of the matter is that the Conservative Party was at the forefront of DEI in this country. If you go back to the 1950s, if you look at someone like Leslie Frost, the Premier of Ontario in 1954, when he institutes the Fair Accommodations Act, which was an act that came out of the experiences of people in southwestern Ontario, Dresden, Ontario, where there was basically apartheid-like conditions. There were places in this province, in this country, where, for example, people of color, black people, were not able to enter certain spaces. The Conservatives in the 1950s recognized that, and they tried to address it in legislation. And you could make the argument that that was a form of DEI. You could also suggest that the whole idea of the West wanting in, in the 1980s, Preston Manning is at the forefront of this movement because the Reform Party, of which one of your mentors, Stephen Harper, was at the forefront of that party, they were pushing this country to recognize that, a large chunk of the population felt as if it wasn't participating fully in this country and that they deserved to have their place, a seat at the table. And eventually, 30 years later, Stephen Harper becomes Prime Minister of the country, and reform takes its place. The West is in. So I'm wondering if, in kind of going after DEI, maybe you're actually forgetting some of its roots in this very country.
I can't speak for all conservatives, of course, but for me, my reservation about DEI broadly defined is not that the underlying argument that there remain people who find themselves outside of the promise of the Canadian project, voices and perspectives need to be accounted for. But that, in a way, the DEI argument, it seems to me, is that the explanation for that is the kind of manifestation of liberalism itself, and that we need, in a way, to curtail liberalism in order to accommodate these people and groups, where I think I would argue that it's an insufficient commitment to liberalism that is the problem. That in a way, we need to kind of double down on a understanding of ourselves and understanding of our society that emphasizes the individual, not that steps back from it. I suspect that some of your listeners would say, well, this sounds like, the old argument about colorblindness. And I concede it kind of is. Like, I think we ought to aspire to live as much as possible in a colorblind society, or a society that is indifferent to, one's sexual preferences or other sources of identity. And the extent to which we don't, where I think I disagree with proponents of DEI, is that the right way to respond isn't, in effect, to kind of give up on that vision and instead try to organize ourselves in a way that accounts for these identities. It's a double down on the notion that, we should aspire to be a meritocratic society in which one's skin pigmentation or sexual preferences or whatever ought not to define individuals.
But it's the fact that it isn't a meritocracy that's the problem, right? That DEI is trying to address the fact that it is not a meritocracy. Right? That people have been given power and privilege not based on their talents, but often they've been given it based on their identity, and that it's a response to that in many ways.
I agree. I mean, I understand that argument, but first of all, I think actually it's more meritocratic than we think or appreciate. One of the things that I like so much about this election campaign, for instance, was that both Poilievre and Carney, in my mind, represented genuine meritocrats, two people who aspired to lead the country, having lived, essentially meritocratic lives. Poilievre is born to a teenage mother in Western Canada, adopted by school teachers, and within one lifetime is knocking on the door to be let into the Prime Minister's office. Bart Carney similarly grows up in Western Canada, and through some combination of intellect, hard work, and probably a bit of luck, goes on to great accomplishments globally and comes home to be Prime Minister. So
I don't want to belabor this too much, but you're not wrong. But maybe you're not right either, that Westerners want in because they feel as if the country's not a meritocracy. They feel as if the country is dominated by this Laurentian cabal that have denied Westerners the opportunity to fully participate and to fully benefit from their own resources. The argument is that if this country were more of a meritocracy, then the West would have been a long time ago. Right?
If you'll just permit me, I know we've been speaking for some time, but this is a crucial point, and I do want to convey it to your audience, and I want to convey it as much to conservatives. What I'm saying is not merely an effort to kind of like justify my own existence or justify my own way of thinking about the world. I think that one mistake conservatives have made in pushing back against this set of issues broadly defined is to not accept the premise, for instance, that we do have systemic racism in our country when we have policies on the books like the Indian Act. It is a policy that defines people based on their ethnicity. That is fundamentally systemic. It's systemic racism by definition. It is anti-liberalism. It is anti-individualist. It is a system of laws and policies and programs that basically tell us the most important thing that we need to know about our indigenous population is their bloodlines. I just think it's fundamentally at odds with how we ought to think about ourselves and how we ought to think about our country. And the expressions of that kind of systemic racism or that way of thinking, I think, is manifest in the Indian residential school experience, where we essentially said, it didn't matter who you were or what made you tick or what your values were. All we needed to know was your ethnic background and your like blood and soil lineage. Like in my mind, Adrian, Indian residential schools were evil and wicked precisely because they were evil and wicked at like their core intellectual proposition, which was that we should be organizing our society based on anything except people's individual identity. And in that sense, I think conservatives have, in my mind, and I accept that this won't be as convincing to everyone, a convincing argument in favor of liberal individualism that extends from the treatment of indigenous people to pushing back against some of the excesses of DEI. The goal really should be to try to lower the salience of race and sexuality and other sources of identity and have a system that ultimately views people, for better or for worse, with warts and all, as individuals.
You've been listening to a clip of In Bed with the Elephant with me, your host, Adrian Harewood. Be sure to check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. And please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and write a review. We love hearing from you.